So, like, how do you personally develop a relationship with each of these individual herbs, and how do you cultivate that intuitive, experiential understanding? I mean, you're probably at a point in your life where you've had just so many of these relationships. How do you know, like, how do you get back to baseline and then build up and, like, see really intimately how it's affecting you when you've had so
Sure.
much in there?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll say for clarity's sake, at this point in my life, I don't really take much of anything anymore. I mean, I took a bunch of stuff for most of my life previously, but these days I don't really take very much of anything, which is great. I'm happy to be at that point of health to where I don't actually really need anything. And Tai Chi and the internal arts kind of do more for me than really anything. But originally, how I developed that relationship and the sensitivity was, I think at the time I was probably vegan or raw vegan. So that is just another fancy way of saying I was starving myself under under the umbrella of
Yeah,
health.
yeah.
uh, so I was very calorically deficient, but it made my system hypersensitive, which is, I would say, a negative thing. But I used it as a positive thing because anytime I took any herbs or teas or whatever, I was like very aware of what they were doing. So I had that capacity kind of in the background quality, let's say, and then I would just maybe make a reishi tea and then drink that and then sit and meditate for like an hour or whatever and just kind of judge, oh, this is kind of before and after how I feel, and then maybe okay, I have to go to work. Okay, so I'll have a bunch of reishi before I go to work, and then I'll kind of just take mental note. How did I feel? What was different? How was I relating to people? The previous issues that I'd always had or stumbling blocks, did they seem to be smoothed out? Did they seem to be easier, or were they worse? And then kind of just mentally keeping a backlog of those sort of things and just kind of keeping track over time. And also, in those days, I didn't really have much of any money. I mean, the vast majority of my adult life, I lived off of like $400 a month, basically.
Wow.
That
Okay.
was it. I mean, I remember when I started my first online sort of business sort of thing in like 2009, and I was making like $500, $1,000 a month, but like completely, fairly, pretty much passive. Like I thought I was rich. I was like, oh my God, I'm making $1,000 a month. Like this is more money I've ever seen in my life. Um, so that's how I started off early, is just developing sensitivity, which if people really want to develop some kind of sensitivity, there is definitely a stripping away process. um, which I would say for most people, vegan, vegetarian, restrictive diet, that's a stripping away diet. That's not typically a building diet. I mean, it can be. Obviously, you have to like kind of juggle and make some things, but typically speaking, that's an aesthetic diet that you're using to kind of like peel back the layers and strip your body down, which can be useful, but maybe do it a little more intelligently than I did. Um, and just learning to start to minimize and cut back on the overall quality and amount of stimulation in your life in general, that can then also help you just have a richer life experience from everything. It doesn't have to be herbs. Because I just noticed like a lot of people, what I've seen is people tend to be on kind of two extremes, as in most things. On one extreme, people just don't really feel anything. They're kind of just a little bit numb, or or a lot of bit numb, depending on how you want to look at it. And then I see people on kind of the other extreme who are like super hypersensitive, like, oh, I can't take holy basil because it's too warming, or like, oh, I can't eat, I don't know, whatever basic food because it's too stimulating. Like, I can't do this, I can't do that. I'm so sensitive. I can't go to the grocery store because I just feel everyone's energy. And like, they just go into this thing, which that's not actually sensitivity. That's just poor health. That's nervous system dysfunction. So I just want to clarify, like, that's not what I mean. I've been on both sides, so I can speak with that with some degree of, but like, you don't want to live your life kind of on either extreme. What basically another way of what I'm describing is like depression and anxiety. Anxiety is like you feel everything so strongly and it's just constantly like all over the place and you feel unstable. Or on the other extreme, you're kind of like Eeyore, whatever, from like that cartoon where you're just like lethargic and life is sort of just flat.
Yeah.
Um, so that's really comes down to people's relationship to stimulation in general, which, you know, that's kind of a bigger a bigger subject we could go down, because what I'm describing there, that's just sort of natural part of becoming an adult. Like the natural experience of getting older is your experience of life gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Like, because you have more experience and your mind is just able to categorize, and oh, this thing is like this, okay, this thing is like this. So you don't actually have to go through the process of actually legitimately feeling and experiencing it. Whereas if you look at the other extreme, when you're a kid, you have no reference for anything. Everything is exciting, everything is interesting, everything is this rich experience because it's completely new. But then over time, you just develop all these reference points, which is, again, natural. But taking the over to a long enough period of time just makes you kind of depressed and flat, which is kind of just how most adult humans live their life, which is why people typically need to just constantly seek stimulation, whether it's porn or video games or music or movies or TV shows or buying stuff or even mental chatter or emotional stimulation or rumination. It's all just stimulation because you're like, in some ways, just kind of bored
Yeah.
because you're not able to actually experience life. So it's kind of a bit of a tangent, but um, yeah, but it should give people some some map for how they can increase their own sensitivity to these things.
Yeah.